1, how does Xinjiang compare with earlier genocides? I'm delighted once again to welcome our chair, Anthony Dirk Moses, from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, also senior editor at the Journal of Genocide Research. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Joe. Welcome to the afternoon panel. Roundtable 1, how does Xinjiang compare with earlier genocides? And we have up here 3 presenters, and we'll start with Roger Lou Phillips from the Syria Justice and Accountability Center in Washington, D.C. His presentation is called Political Persecutions or Genocide, Lessons from the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. Welcome.
All right, thanks very much. Thank you, Joe, first of all, for hosting this really important event. And thank you to all the presenters who have really enlightened me with all of your presentations. So I really appreciate that. My name is Roger Lou Phillips. I am the legal director at the Syria Justice and Accountability Center. And at SJAC, we are compiling evidence of war crimes in Syria and putting together dossiers for the prosecution of war crimes and other violations pursuant to universal jurisdiction. So there's some cases ongoing in Germany right now, and we're involved in those. But today, I'm here to talk about something slightly different, about my prior experience working at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, and how, almost lost the computer, and how China actually had prior knowledge and experience with genocide of a Muslim minority group. So let me just back up and say that the events in Xinjiang are not the first time that the Chinese government had experience with genocide of a Muslim minority. And I'm going to be talking today about the Khmer Rouge regime, which ruled from 1975 to 1979 in Cambodia. They committed a genocide against the Cham Muslim minority. These facts have been found by a UN hybrid tribunal, and 2 accused were found guilty of involvement in these crimes. 1 was convicted for genocide, 1 for persecution. And that case remains on appeal for the accused person who is still alive. So, there's a couple of threads here that I need to tie together. One about the Khmer Rouge, one about Chinese support. And so let me start with the Khmer Rouge. Democratic Kampuchea was what the country of Cambodia was known as at the time. The Khmer Rouge ruled from 1975 to 1979. They sought to achieve an agrarian utopian society. And in order to do that, they evacuated all of the cities when they took over the country. They created a countrywide workforce in an effort to support this revolution through rice exports. They thought that by increasing rice exports, they could create enough income for the country to have equality and everyone with the same means. But the policy was failed, or at least the execution of the policy was failed, and it led to mass starvation. The Khmer Rouge leadership was composed of the Standing Committee, which is Pol Pot, Nyon Chea, Son Sen, and others. Nyon Chea was one of the accused in the case that I worked on. They were notoriously paranoid and executed and had internal purges of tens of thousands of individuals who opposed them. There are estimates that 2 million of a population of 8 million Cambodians died during that time. So a subset of crimes that we'll talk about later is about the Cham, but let me just give a piece of information that I found to be darkly ironic. Really, at the beginning of the Khmer Rouge period, China at the highest levels provided warnings to the Khmer Rouge. So Zhou Enlai, from his deathbed, said to Khieu Samphan and Ng Thierry, who are 2 senior leaders of the Khmer Rouge, to avoid excesses of the Cultural Revolution. Deng Xiaoping also criticized the Khmer Rouge for the evacuation of cities, and these criticisms and warnings went unheeded by the Khmer Rouge. So what was the genocide of the Cham? I think it's really interesting just to hear all of the evidence that was put forward yesterday, because there's so many corollaries between what is happening in Xinjiang right now and what happened to the Cham in Cambodia. So the Cham are an ethnic and religious minority group. They have their own language, their own culture, whereas the DK Constitution actually guaranteed freedom of religion. In actual fact, reactionary religions were all banned. That meant all religion. Buddhist monks were defrocked. Places of worship, churches, mosques were destroyed. And these are findings from the Case 2-2 judgment that came out in 2018. So they found that the CPK, the Communist Party of Kampuchea, was specifically targeting the Cham population in order to fully assimilate them. And this brings to mind David's talk. He was talking about fusion as social death, right? So there seems to be this correlation there. Second, that militia arrested entire Cham families, parents, children. They're forced to eat pork, not permitted to play. Copies of the Quran were burned. There was also, they were also forbid to wear headscarves and forced women to cut their hair short. And this is, very similar to what we heard from Elise and others about, the same imposition of these kinds of requirements in Xinjiang. Also, Tim mentioned that there's an attempt, or there's a quotation about seeking to weaken and sever the socio-spiritual roots. And I found that really compelling, that this kind of correlated with that. They were also subject to mass forcible displacement. And the Khmer Rouge said that this was necessary in order to put workforces where they were required to build dams or to do farming. But in actual fact, it diluted the Cham minority group as they were forced to live in Khmer communities and deprived them of their cultural practices. The DK leadership advocated a notion of ethnic purity to obtain a pure Khmer race, and the Khmer is the dominant, the majority ethnic group in Cambodia. And finally, lists of Cham were compiled, and there were instances of mass killings. I think most people, when they think of the Khmer Rouge, think of this last element as indicative and fully descriptive of the Khmer Rouge, and in actual fact, that was a part of how people died during this time. But as I said, mass starvation and sickness was another way. So the second thread I'd like to draw in here in my remaining time is Chinese assistance to the Khmer Rouge. And for this, I'm indebted to Andrew Murtha, who did a very interesting study on this by interviewing Chinese technical workers who were in Cambodia providing assistance. Mao had promised, as I said, $1 billion in aid. You can see on the right, if you look very closely, that there were lists of documents showing exactly how much money was being provided in material, and there were thousands of technical advisors throughout the country working on different projects to build an airport, to work on a petroleum refinery. Some of these failed, some did not, but regardless of which, there were thousands of these Chinese advisors, and they were eyewitness to what happened in Cambodia during this time. So, it begs the question, what responsibility did China have for the genocide of the Cham? Well, Murtha argues that the Chinese didn't have much influence despite all of this economic benefit they were providing, despite the fact that they were propping up the Khmer Rouge. That, for example, the Chinese said, well, you should build an airport in a particular location. The Khmer Rouge rejected it and had final say, and it was built at Krong Liv. And nonetheless, I think you must understand that the Chinese technical advisors must have known what was going on in the country. They knew that people were disappearing on a massive scale. I have 10 minutes? Yeah, ish. Okay, let me speak briefly about this because it brings to mind this argument that the clampdowns in Xinjiang are required in order to suppress uprisings, to suppress terrorism. And that there were two uprisings that really led to massive killings of Cham. These happened around Ramadan, and there were the burning of Quran, and there were 2 uprisings that were examined within the judgment. The defense teams had different arguments on this. They said that the security measures against certain Cham were not because of their identity, cultural and religious identity. It was only because they had risen up in opposition of the government. The Q Sampan defense, they had a different argument. They said that, well, yes, the Cham suffered, but so did everybody else. There was no discrimination. They were all subject to the same conditions. And both of these defenses were rejected by the trial chamber. They found that there was evidence within the documents and within testimony that showed that there was intent to discriminate specifically against the Cham and to eliminate them. And I've been really compelled by the documents that I've seen that were from 2019 in that leak, and I think there is some interesting correlation in the language, although translation may not bear that out. But at the Khmer Rouge, the Ankar gave instruction to smash 100% of the Cham, Ankar being the organization or the leadership, regardless of their ethnicity, whether Cham or Khmer. There were telegrams, so official government documents, which are extremely important leakage evidence in these proceedings. And that these said that there's a mass transfer of the Cham, and it was designed to disperse them as a group. And there were other telegrams talking about the need to sweep clean the Cham enemy. Of course, the phrases themselves, to smash or to sweep clean, might have some ambiguity, and you need to have testimonial evidence to help clarify what those terms mean. So you have, China's Uyghur policy where you have to round up everyone who should be rounded up, the Yingshuo, Jinshuo. And so, I guess there is some ambiguity as to what that could mean. So if you have an insider witness who could come forward and tell you this is exactly what they meant. They meant to use all necessary means. For example, in the Syrian government documents that we've obtained, there's often a notation to do the necessary, which what we know from other insider witnesses is up to and including killing individuals. So I would just say that there are a number of corollaries here, but it just shows the importance of the government documents and then of having insider witnesses as well. So I'm really out of time here, but let me just conclude on a slightly hopeful note. The Cham minority remain a robust and existent minority group living in Cambodia, not persecuted, able to practice their religion and cultural practices. They also were engaged within the tribunal and provided valuable evidence and testimony. And so with that, I'm just hopeful that there can be some justice opportunities found for Uyghurs as well.
Thanks very much. Our next speaker is Penny Green from Queen Mary University in London, who has a PowerPoint, I believe.
I do.
Yes.
I do.
Okay.
Okay, can you hear me? Fine. Thank you very much for organising this amazing conference, Joe, Hanno, and the team. I think it's a really important event, and I'm really privileged to be here. I've learned a tremendous amount already. My contribution comes as a criminologist. I work on state crime, and in terms of genocide, I have worked most recently on the Rohingya genocide. And so I'm going to begin by framing the way in which we approach state crime and therefore genocide by a definition that my colleague Tony Ward and I came up with in 2004, and that is human rights violations carried out by state agents in pursuit of state organizational goals. We don't rely on legal definitions, as will become clear as I go through. The law can be helpful, but we find a criminological, sociological definition much more valuable, particularly in terms of the possibility of intervening in what is a process. And we must remember that genocide is a process. It's not a moment of spectacularized violence, though that might be part of that process. So you might remember that this was probably the first image that people saw of the Rohingya fleeing Myanmar in 2015. I'm going to be very brief, so there'll be the opportunity for questions and contributions later. But this is when we actually published our first report in 2015, and we've been doing work for a couple of years beforehand inside Myanmar, both in Yangon, but particularly in Sittwe, the capital of Rakhine State, where the majority of the Rohingya live. And it's also important to remember that there are criminals involved in a genocide, and these two, General Min Aung Hlaing, who led the coup in February, who is now leading the military dictatorship inside Myanmar, and his compatriot Aung San Suu Kyi, who, in my view, was equally complicit. I think it's just really important to remember that these are the architects, that it's central to the genocidal process which followed. Now, when we published our report, this is what we wrote, and this is, I think, really important when you're thinking about the Uyghur and the stage that the Uyghur are currently experiencing in terms of what I would say is definitely a genocidal process. We wrote in 2015 that a genocidal process is underway in Myanmar, and if it follows the path outlined in this report, it's yet to be completed. It can be stopped, but not without confronting the fact that it is indeed a genocide. And that's the value of the term genocide too. It makes people stop and think. We can talk more about that, of course. Now, unfortunately, Daniel isn't here today, Daniel Fierstein. He's recovering from surgery. And so I'll spend a little bit of time looking at Daniel's stagist approach to genocide. And I also do acknowledge the work of Greg Stanton, who also did very important work on genocide. And I'll also show some images later, but I think that these stages, if you like, and they often run concurrently. I don't mean them to be independent stages which follow one after the other. They often exist concurrently. But I think that from what I've heard so far, that there are very many parallels with what's happening to the Uyghur. So stage one is effectively the stigmatization or the dehumanization. You need to dehumanize your fellow citizens if you are to commit atrocities against them, generally speaking. If we look at the literature on state crime, this is what we've learned. And there was a long process combined with hate crimes led by right-wing monks and by the government, a hate crime against the Muslim population, particularly the Rohingya, who live in the northwest of the country. The second stage is, once you've created a situation in which a targeted population is dehumanized, then sporadic violence takes place. It's almost like a testing moment. Can we get away with violence against this group that have been dehumanized and stigmatized? And in fact, in 2012 was an absolutely pivotal moment. Around 200 Rohingya were killed in attacks on the Rohingya neighborhoods of Sittwe. And that led to them fleeing the capital, apart from one ghetto. The sporadic violence resulted in not a single prosecution and basically gave a green light for violence to be perpetrated against the Rohingya. Stage 3 follows very often from the sporadic violence, and it did in this case. So following, when the Rohingya were fleeing, they were directed into an area around Bume Junction, which now has become a detention camp complex, or a concentration camp, as the Rakhine nationalists prefer to call it. It is a concentration/detention camp centre, and there are a number of camps, and there are approximately 140,000 Rohingya still in those camps in Myanmar, and we know very little now about what's happening to them. Once a targeted group is isolated and ghettoized, then it's much easier to systematically weaken them, to reduce the amount of food that's going into the ghetto or into the camps. It's much easier to deny them freedom of movement. So the Rohingya have no freedom of movement inside Rakhine State. Much easier to deny them education and to massively limit their health opportunities. Médecins Sans Frontières were expelled from Rakhine State for speaking out about a massacre that took place against the Rohingya. So once they were gone, there was no emergency medical care for the Rohingya. And so we heard earlier about social death, Claudia Card's concept. And when you go in, when we went into those camps in 2013-14, social death was just, it's the perfect way to capture the experience of going into those camps. The depression that pervaded the atmosphere, no livelihood opportunities, no work, no education, nothing to do. These desolate, horrible places, squalid and places of wretched misery. Then in 2016 and 17, after we had published our warning, if you like, which the British government took no notice of, I'll come to that in a moment, we had probably what we would call the annihilation stage. And that was 2016, and then more significantly in 2017, the Burmese military, with the full knowledge of Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD, the National League for Democracy, launched what they called military operations, a clearance operation, or what we would call a genocidal massacre, against the Rohingya of northern Rakhine State. And in that massacre, it's very difficult to determine how many people were killed, maybe between 12 and 25,000, we're not sure, but 800,000 people were forced to flee their burning homes. Over 350 villages were destroyed, burnt to the ground, and a mass exodus fled Myanmar across the border into Bangladesh, into what is now the largest open-air camp in the world. After that process, oh, I'm sorry, we haven't been doing the slides. Sorry, hate campaigns, burnt mosque, the camps that I've just spoken about. You can see how squalid and appalling they are inside Myanmar. Isolation, systematic weakening, malnutrition amongst children was very high. This is the annihilation stage. This is an example of the people who fled over a very short period of time into Bangladesh. Symbolic enactment is the sixth stage, what Daniel Feuerstein would call the final stage of genocide. It's all about denial. It's all about rewriting the history of the defeated population, if you like, creating an opportunity for the new society to be built on the ruins of the old. And in this image, it's quite important. You can see this was a mixed village, a mixed Rakhine, which are the dominant ethnic group, and the Rohingya. Now, the white area, you can see trees and village roofs. That's the Rakhine area. That still exists. The Rakhine still live there. The white was completely burnt, and all the Rohingya had to flee. And then you can see some blue roofs, and those roofs represent the Myanmar state rebuilding on the ruins of Rohingya lives, detention centres and a new military base. And here, I'm now thinking, sort of intellectually, we're thinking about the role of the camp as a seventh stage in the genocidal process, and that's work to be done. But I think it's really important because Kutupalong refugee camp is a massive sprawl. It's a city camp. There are over 1 million people in this camp. Without the infrastructure, without support, without access to Bangladeshi education. Is that 2 minutes? Yeah. And so what we're finding now, and reports from NGOs, MSF and so on in the field, is that organised crime is taking over, forming some kind of proxy government and so on. And this will only continue. I mean, it's offering protection because the Bangladesh state is refusing to offer protection, creating an even more dire situation for the population of the camps. This is the cover of our book, and I put that there, I mean, our report, because we sent it to actually Boris Johnson when he was the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs. And it speaks to the debate that we have started to have about law and genocide and civil society. Johnson's response was, well, it's not a genocide until a court of law proclaims it as a genocide, so bad luck. And that was that. I'm not going to say much more about that because I'm seeing, but this final slide is perhaps we can bring this up in discussion, because what I would say is that the law intervenes too late, too clumsily, too clunkily. It doesn't have the capacity to intervene to prevent genocide. Civil society has that capacity. It's how we make it happen. Thank you.
So the next speakers are chiming in from abroad, online. It's Hanno, SCHEDLER and Jasna, CAUSEVIC, who are Referenten für Genozidprävention und Schutzverantwortung, I guess from Germany. And the title is Denialists, Lessons from the Genocide in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Over to you. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I will start. I am Jasna CAUSEVIC from Society for Frightened Peoples in Germany. I am responsible for genocide prevention and responsibility to protect. I am honored to be attending this conference on genocide in Xinjiang and hope to contribute some insights from our organization's work in Bosnia and Herzegovina during and since the 1992 to 1995 Bosnian War. Do you hear me? Okay. In 1995, an international peace settlement, the Dayton Accords, brought the war to an end and divided the country into two autonomous entities, the Bosniak and Croat Federation with 51% of the area of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the Serb Republika Srpska with 49%. Dayton rewarded the Bosnian Serbs, the principal perpetrators of so-called ethnic cleansing and genocide during the war, with the recognition of their claim to an autonomous national territory from which they had removed the non-Serb population. In the years since Dayton, Bosnia's neighbors have continued to pursue their territorial ambitions by encouraging separatist initiatives aimed at undermining Bosnia's existence as a multi-ethnic sovereign state. Their tactics have included anti-Muslim and nationalist propaganda, and above all, the refusal to acknowledge and accept responsibility for war crimes, including genocide. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia confirmed that members of various joint criminal enterprises were responsible for orchestrating a war of international aggression in which members of Bosnia's Serb and Croat communities and their allies in Serbia and Croatia mobilized against the Bosnian Muslim community. The tribunal determined that the plan existed to remove non-Serbs from territory claimed by the Bosnian Serbs and found Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic, the political and military leaders of the Bosnian Serbs, guilty of genocide in seeking to destroy the Bosnian Muslim community of Eastern Bosnia. Denial of genocide, specifically the genocide at Srebrenica, and of the legally established narrative of the war is central to the Bosnian Serbs' ongoing effort to secede from Bosnia and unite with their fellow Serbs in Serbia. Firstly, let me remind you that 1948 Genocide Convention recognizes that genocide is not a complicated fact, it is a process which signatory states are required to prevent, not just to punish. So, denial of genocide is not just a way of evading criminal responsibility for past acts. It has also to be seen as a means of keeping open the space in which the process can be continued and taken to completion. In the moment of genocide, denial may serve to avoid intrusive inquiries that could jeopardize genocidal plans. Reports of the reality of the Prijedor concentration and death camps helped create the international climate of opinion that made intervention in Bosnia possible. When governments try to portray acts of oppression as benevolent or at least disinterested, it's essential that journalists and human rights organizations are able to investigate the truth. Personal testimony can be backed up by evidence of the destruction of social and cultural institutions. By the slaughter of more than 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys at Srebrenica in July 1995 has been legally judged a crime of genocide, Serbian and Bosnian Serb officials still refuse to accept the designation. The International Court of Justice conservative finding that Serbia had failed to prevent genocide, but despite support for the perpetrators, had not been directly responsible for genocide, was disappointing. This is why, despite the real achievements of the ICTY, we remain wary of relying too much on the effectiveness of purely judicial mechanism of justice. Milorad Dodik, currently the Bosnian Serb member of the tripartite presidency of Bosnia, has called the genocide at Srebrenica the biggest shame of the 20th century. The Serbian parliament still refuses to recognize the massacre as genocide, finding various explanations to excuse or mitigate the crime. In Republika Srpska and Serbia, convicted war criminals are glorified and their crimes celebrated. Genocide deniers are honored, and the construction of memorials identifying the victims is obstructed. Denial and the presentation of alternative narratives ensure that the threat of a resumption of previous violence is always present. Gregory Stanton has written that denial is one of the surest indicators of further genocidal massacres. Denial not only creates a toxic moral climate, it serves as a weapon of discrimination and intimidation. Members of the targeted group forfeit their right to empathy and justice. Their legitimate identity is denied, and they are forcibly made aware of their vulnerability and lack of protection against further harm. The wider political context is crucially important. The Bosnian Serb authorities have used the privileged status granted them by Dayton to disrupt the functioning of the Bosnian state and promote their own interests through disrespect for the rule of law and historical revisionism. Serbia's ally, Russia, was persuaded to use its United Nations Security Council veto to defeat a draft Security Council resolution seeking to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the Srebrenica genocide. The support of foreign artists and writers, such as the notorious pro-Serb apologist Peter Handke, winner of the 2019 Nobel Prize for Literature, is used to suggest intellectual legitimacy. More recently, Valentin Inzko, the special representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina, has finally used his special powers to criminalize the glorification of war criminals and the revision of historical facts. The rise of nationalism, xenophobia, and Islamophobia across Europe has impeded efforts to combat denial. The glorification of Serb nationalism has inspired murderous acts of anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant terrorism, for example, in Norway and in New Zealand. We need to be aware of the potential for Uyghurs to be made the target of similar antagonism and hatred. We believe that the key to combating genocide denial and preventing a repeat of the past is structural. Through its inaction, the international community has helped to consolidate the gains of genocide. It must condemn and sanction all attempts to deny the true or minimize the reality of genocide. It should also support constitutional reforms needed to neutralize the discriminatory and exclusionary policies of Republika Srpska, including establishment of the principle of nationality based on citizenship rather than ethnicity. It must support the restoration of the rule of law and an end to impunity, and the reform of election laws to ensure that perpetrators of genocide are not its beneficiaries. Similarly, it must act to protect of minority rights, freedom of speech, media freedom, and freedom of assembly, as well to implement support for traumatized survivors and the next generation, common educational curricula, full investigation of the fate of those still missing, and respect for historical memory. We believe that a just peace means recognizing the truth about genocide and taking appropriate action to help build a democratic, unified, multicultural nation, which is ultimately the strongest safeguard against genocide in Xinjiang as well as in Bosnia. Thank you very much.
So, coming to China and Xinjiang, East Turkestan, what is China doing on the UN level, for example? It's using its might at the UN to assemble a coalition of states to praise its so-called accomplishments in Xinjiang, East Turkestan, and thus defending itself against countries or statements by countries that criticize its atrocities. It also organizes events and exhibitions that show what they see as great achievements on the human rights front. The Chinese government also produces high-quality videos that try to show that the Uyghurs and the Kazakhs are happy and well, and there's absolutely no reason for international criticism. Useful foreign idiots are being used as well, who are claiming that everything is fine. They are, if you excuse me, I'm not a scholar, flooding the zone with shit. Another challenge is to counter the claims of outfits such as the Grey Zone, you all know them. So what can we do? What must we do? What we can do is try to link Uyghur activists with governments and institutions such as the UN in order for them to directly connect with decision makers, as well as the media and ordinary citizens who are still not yet aware enough about what's going on. We must stand up with them on the streets in front of Volkswagen, for example, to demand that Volkswagen pulls out of Xinjiang, East Turkestan. We must stand with them in front of the Olympic sponsor Allianz in Munich to demand they publicly criticize the crimes of the Chinese government. We must stand with them in front of the Chinese embassies and consulates to confront the denials that are still going on. The German government, for example, on the UN level has been quite critical towards the atrocities committed by the Chinese government, though not as much on the bilateral or EU-China level. So it's a pretty mixed bag, and we and others will push the new government, whoever it will be, to be more insistent on all levels when it comes to the crimes in Xinjiang. And in order to be convincing towards others that the Chinese government must be held accountable, we also must get our human rights house in order as well. For example, if I may get to another topic briefly, when it comes to acknowledging that the German Empire committed a genocide against the Herero, Nama, and Damara and San in the beginning of the 20th century in today's Namibia, Germany has acknowledged, yes, we commit genocide, but yet it violates internationally agreed on norms by insisting that it should and it will not pay reparations. And the German government often claims that it's a defender of multilateralism and the rule of law, but when it comes to its, how it takes on its own crimes, yes, it's acknowledging what happened, its own crimes, but it's not agreeing to that it should pay reparations. And it would be much more convincing if you are really in favor of universal human rights, you act on all fronts on them. So we must speak out on that topic as well if we want to defend the values of universal human rights and help the Uyghur cause. Thank you.
Thanks very much for our patient contributors from Germany and for keeping to time. Now that means that our final speaker formally before the discussion is Professor Mark Levene, recently retired from the University of Southampton and author of many, many important books on genocide in world history. Mark.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes? Good, good. Right. It's been good to hear in the last couple of days that in discussing genocide more generally, this is not a phenomenon which is just about mad, bad, or sad societies out there. It's about the trajectory of our own world political economy. I'm not going to develop that too much today because I haven't got time, but in In this instance, what I'm doing, I've set myself a challenge as a generalist on genocide studies in terms of where do we place what is happening now in Xinjiang in historical terms, and to ask myself, is it part of a pattern? And in doing that, I've decided not to talk about genocide writ large, but to suggest that actually what we might be looking at in terms of looking at that broader pattern is to start with this journal, the Central Asian Survey, which Joe has talked about, and to say this is our immediate geographical locale, not East Turkestan, but that area which is defined by this journal, Turkestan writ large, an area which Halford Mackinder, 150 years ago, talked about as the world heartland. In other words, something really very, very important. But the process which is interesting is how it became the hinterland of two competing empires. Are we getting a buzz or something? No. Russia and China. Now, in terms of trying to place Xinjiang in terms of this, one can think of moments in time where there were spectacular genocides in the past. The Zhangga genocide in 1757 to 59 is the most dramatic event of its kind in the 18th century. A century later, there was the destruction of the Khanate of Kashgar, of Kashgaria, which was genocidal in its own right. And it's difficult to place what's happening in Xinjiang now quite in those terms, though perhaps it's not unconnected, in the sense that what I think we should see over the last couple of 100 years is the process by which those hinterlands, those peripheries to the Russian and Chinese empires were gradually, by process, gobbled up, and the peoples who were very heterogeneous in this frame of reference were deemed to be backward, disloyal, problematic, and were required to become pacified, homogenized, made loyal, modernized in this process. And if they didn't, they were perceived as obstacles, problematic obstacles. There's also something else which I think is sort of relevant, even though it may sound a bit bonkers in terms of where we're at now. And that is a reminder that it was from these Central Asian heartlands that we have Chinggis, we have the Golden Horde, we have thus, in modern times, still a resonance of a neurosis of these peoples, these nomads coming out of the steppes and invading and destroying Russia or China. And I think that neurosis is actually something which you get in modern genocides. It's this fear, this anxiety, this built-in neurosis of peoples. Now, having said that, how much does this take us through to the modern period? Because there is a paradox, and the paradox in relation to Turkestan writ large, as I'm describing it, is that both the Chinese and the Soviet arenas came under communist control. And the communists, and this is a paradox, have a certain sensitivity about destroying ethnic groups, at least on paper, in principle. They see genocide as, to use an old Bolshevik term, zoological. You're not meant to you can re-educate people, You can remember that the Soviet form from the 1920s onwards, as also derived into the Chinese communist position, is that you have societies which are national in form and socialist in content. So you're not meant to destroy ethnic entities. The very fact that you have a Uyghur autonomous region is indicative of that. So the question then becomes, when you have problematic populations who stand in the way of your modernizing process, how do you erase them without obliterating them? How do you obliterate them without a recourse to overt genocide? And for here, in relation to that problem, I had to resort to a little bit of sociological thinking from Zygmunt Bauman, who in turn took his idea from Claude Lévi-Strauss. The concepts involved here are ones of anthropemia and anthropophagia. Namely, if you have inside your body something which is alien, how do you deal with it? And the anthropophagia is you vomit it out. Or anthropemia, you ingest it to the point where it becomes, without blemishes, entirely like yourself. No blemish. That's modernity for you. That is not, in my view, an apple. It is some modernistic, strange contraption. But it tells us about the world we are in different ways trying to create. Now, briefly, Soviet method. The Soviet method in relation to its Turkic peoples, Muslim or Buddhist, possibly, was anthropophagic. Blech! You vomit them out, you take them apart from the people who are okay, and for the Soviet state, there was places to put them into, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. So the Ingush, the Chechens, the Kalmyks, the Tatars were all in the mid-1940s onwards, they were vomited out. The idea was not on paper to genocidally destroy them, though actually that's what happened, right? By the way, it's quite interesting, when you make other parallels here, you disintegrate these people in the process and they become linked in with the people who are living where you have dumped them. This was the idea in principle, too, with what was done to the Armenians in 1915. They were meant to be disintegrated into the populations who they were vomited out to, though, of course, we know that this was plain genocide in practice. Now, Chinese version. The Chinese version I take to be essentially anthropemic in terms of how it has developed. Not just Xinjiang, Tibet. In this instance, you swamp with Han, you suffocate, you emasculate, you reduce. In the case of the Uyghurs and the Kazakhs and the peoples of Xinjiang, the new province, this new consolidated area, all the way back 200 years to the destruction of the Zhangars. Here, the modern version is, as we've heard, it's deroot, it's sterilize, it's to do this to the survivors, to make them without blemishes, but somehow it doesn't read to me as directly, exactly part of a pattern. There's something new about this. There's something sui generis about this. It's very modern. It's think Shoshana Zuboff's book, Surveillance Capitalism. This seems to me to be a very Orwellian surveillance, genocide, slow, lingering genocide in process. And in that sense, the fact that it is so high-tech, so very surveillance, it's a warning to us all about where we're heading.
So this gives us a good 20 minutes for discussion. If anyone, let's take a round of questions or points. We have time. Anyone wants to chime in, please raise their hand. So there's 1, 2. Anyone else? And 3. So yes, let's wait for the mic.
Okay, can you hear me? So this is for Dr. Levine. I found the notion you talked about, the notion you brought up about like step neurosis to be like really interesting, and I'm wondering if you think that this neurosis is like, if this attribution of like barbarism to the peoples of Central Asia in general is directly part of the thinking that has led to these policies, or if it's some sort of like underlying factor that has allowed these attitudes to persist. Like, do you think the geographic location is what has allowed this to, I guess, be continued to the extent that it is, rather than? I don't know if that was clearly phrased. I'm sorry.
Your question? Yeah, that's great. Dr. Steenberg.
Sorry. Thanks a lot. I too have a question to not only the last speaker, but actually the last sentence. That this makes us have to think about where we're headed. I was wondering where in your understanding are we headed, and which factors is it that play into us heading in that direction? So you mentioned surveillance capitalism as a book, and you connect that somehow to the surveillance state in Xinjiang. There are probably other factors involved also that you see sort of on a global level happening, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit. Thank you.
And it's Dr. Klimesh? No? Well, you had your hand up, right? Yes, sorry, I didn't get your name. So.
Thanks. Yes, John Henshaw from the University of Exeter. I'm afraid my question is also to Mark Levine, and it was just really with the Soviet comparison. I mean, it seems to me that, and it's not my field, genocide research, but the most obvious comparisons from a regional perspective are early Soviet modernization and assimilation of the Central Asians. You brought that up. And then very specifically, the most obvious comparison would be the Kazakh famine of the early 1930s, which has been subject to early Soviet history research and some excellent works by Kazakh historians, and Sarah Cameron's book nearly 10 years ago. I'm not an historian, but to my knowledge, genocide is not regularly associated with the Kazakh famine, and yet it was specifically an act which killed 1.5 million people. It was targeted against the nomadic people, a specific group for their lifestyle, and measures were targeted towards them, which led to the enormous destruction in parts of their people group. So, I mean, I'm not sure anyone, including yourself on the panel, is necessarily qualified to speak to that specific case, but it does seem to me very interesting to raise the question of where the possible comparators are, and particularly because, you know, that we're coming up to the centenary relatively soon of that, and that is a live issue in Kazakhstan. Some of the Kazakh participants will know in terms of how they remember their history.
Mark, I guess you have a few things directed to you.
God, right. Well, actually, towards Avi's question, you should read Dirk Moses's book, latest book, Problems of Genocide, because actually he talks a lot about this in more general terms, the notion of the civilized versus the barbarian or the savage. This is not peculiar to the Central Asian situation, nor the neuroses which go with it. And just to follow on from that, I think there is a broader issue here about ourselves as a species, which brings on to is it Rune's question, about the barbarian at the gate, because what is the factor which is driving me all the time now in terms of how I'm looking at the world? It is climate change and how that is impacting upon all sorts of societies around the world and how they will be on the move. And I can't remember what, so how does this link, how does what's happening in Xinjiang now link into the broader picture? I think we are moving towards much more controlled societies where as resource issues become critical and refugees become part of a fact of life, including ourselves. Any of us could become environmental refugees in the coming years or decades. This is now becoming the reality which we all have to face. I think state controls on populations and movements and the surveillance which we now have are part of the totalitarian, authoritarian picture which we are going to have to struggle against, as we also struggle against the forces which are accelerating climate change. Sorry that this seems to be so off-beam, but that's how I'm looking at the world and us as a species in relation to it. Right, third one. Yes, you're right, but it's only it is one of the catastrophes. I think from a historian's point of view, there's a sort of question of how was it that all these different peoples, not only steppe peoples, but steppe peoples, nomads, pastoralists, how has their world, which was so central to Turkestan, to Central Asia, has disappeared in such a short space of time. Just like, and I suppose you could make parallels with what happened on the American continent in such a short space of time. I mean, this is a blip in historical and geological time, but this has happened in this way, and sometimes I can't get my head around it. We could have a discussion, which would have to be somewhere else, about whether what happened in 1932 to 33, 34 was consciously enacted, or whether the state, the Stalinist state, then chose to use this occasion to erase populations who were considered problematic. And I tend to go for the second view, that the intent wasn't there from the beginning, but how convenient was it to get rid of these people or to suffocate them to such a point where you could then start doing what had actually been part of the imperial project before that, to open up these areas to settler colonialism, to modernization, to cotton production, etc., 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 the road to climate change.
Okay, we've got time now for another round. So, sorry, I know you were Joe, and is there a third taker? Joe, oh, sorry, yes. Yeah. Sorry.
Harris from SOAS, University of London, yes. Penny, one for you, please. I've really appreciated your talk, and I think the stages that you lay out are very helpful in thinking through these processes. You were a bit pushed for time at the end. You said very briefly that you thought pursuing the law was too slow and clunky, and you would prefer to mobilize civil society as a method. I think it's very interesting for us to learn from your personal experience of trying to push the Rohingya case in the UK, so I'd like to hear a bit more about that, please.
Yeah, I was going to ask that same question, and then I was going to back it up and rebound it to Roger and say, okay, Roger, as a practicing lawyer, do you think there is any purchase at all on trying to pursue legal channels rather than civil society channels, as Penny might advocate? And if so, what are they?
Okay. Okay, well, Penny and then...
Thanks. Thanks both. It's interesting. I think, the definition I put up of state crime right at the beginning, state organizational goals pursued by state agents, human rights violations that are a product of state organizational goals. How do we determine whether human rights violations have taken place, and how do we determine whether these are part of a state's organizational goals? We rely very heavily on civil society in order to deliver that kind of data for us. And human rights organizations have played a really important role in presenting that kind of data. I'm not romantic about civil society, I should say. And I'm not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think that legal struggles can form part of civil activism and should form part of civil activism, but we have to be realistic about the way the wheels of international law and how slowly they turn, and how that if we're thinking about justice, we have to determine, does that mean 1 or 2 prosecutions of members of the Burmese military 10, 20 years down the line? Or does it mean delivering justice for the Rohingya right now and delivering some kind of economic and social justice to the Rohingya right now? And I think that's where we rely on civil society to put pressure. I mean, there are a range of actions that civil society can engage in. And as I said, we presented our findings in 2015 to the government because we felt sure that if we benchmarked what was happening to the Rohingya against historic genocides on the basis of 176 interviews with Rohingya, with Rakhine, with state officials inside Rakhine State, it was pretty clear to us that this was a genocide. And if we understand it as a process, then we have the opportunity to intervene at any of these points. Whereas if we adopted a wholly legalistic approach, we don't have that opportunity. We have to wait, as Boris Johnson told us, until a court of law has determined it's a genocide. And then we are, and I think that's really problematic. I know John's shaking his head, but I mean, that is ultimately what happens. And is justice simply delivering a number of prosecutions against some of the more overt perpetrators? So I know that Aung San Suu Kyi isn't listed, for example, amongst the generals that were going to be presented to the ICC ultimately. Whereas if you look at the history of the Rohingya genocide, then she plays an absolutely vital role as a perpetrator. The other thing I wanted to add just in terms of civil society, as I said, I'm not romantic about it. It's problematic, and particularly in Myanmar. It was civil society that led many of the racist hate campaigns, the monks, Rakhine nationalists, and so on. But interestingly, post-coup, there is some movement, some recognition that those who are now experiencing the repressions of the Burmese military, the Myanmar military, are now beginning to identify with what happened to the Rohingya and are starting to stand up in solidarity with the Rohingya. I mean, it's very late in the day, but this is, you know, one sort of spark of light, I think, in what has been a very, very sad demise. I don't know if that answers the question. No, I think domestically and globally. I mean, I think that you know, and those sort of activist organisations, both civil and global, need to be intersectional. I mean, you know, they need to relate to Black Lives Matter. They need to relate to other solidarity movements. They need to relate to the Extinction Rebellion, the campaigns against climate change. We need to build something much more united if we want to tackle these kind of violations, because I do think they start from ultimately the same place, and that's global capitalism.
Roger.
Let me just start by saying I agree largely with Penny. But I'll keep going, though. I'll say something else. I work very closely with Syrian civil society, and there are many groups that are doing valuable work. My organization, in addition to compiling and documenting war crimes, we work in northeast Syria to train a first responders team to excavate mass graves. And that is not only for judicial processes, but it's also to help bring closure to individuals who have lost people, the missing persons, for example, and the families of the missing. So I think there's room for both. I think civil society has power to advocate, to raise awareness, to document, but at some point the power of states is required, and being able to convince states to take action. I agree that it is somehow unfulfilling to look at the sheer numbers of individuals, how few there are that have been prosecuted successfully in international tribunals. But I don't think that number itself is indicative of whether justice was served or not, because they are representative of a broader whole. There are findings about governmental policies. There are hundreds of, well, in the case of Cambodia, thousands of civil parties, plaintiffs, victims, who are able to join in the proceedings and take an active part. There are hundreds of thousands of Cambodians who come and observe the proceedings to see in this ritualized environment that is the courtroom, where people can air their grievances, and you can see the catharsis in the witnesses as they recount the stories. And you can talk to Cambodians throughout the country who relate to those that are on the stand and realize that, it wasn't just me in my own village that suffered these abuses. It was going on throughout the country. It wasn't just an abusive person. It was a governmental policy. And it allows the country to re-examine its history. Before the Khmer Rouge Tribunal was created, there was not a module in the schools taught about that time period in history. And it has been discussed extensively now, and there is, as part of reparations that are allowed there, symbolic reparations, there was a module, a teaching module created to be distributed in the schools. I am the first to criticize international justice. There are many failures, but I don't think it should be thrown out and cast aside entirely. As far as Uyghurs are concerned, I think that there are a number of potential avenues to pursue. I think that there are significant challenges because of the political dynamics as they exist in the UN Security Council, because of China's power. But I think that Sophie Richardson is correct, that universal jurisdiction provides some opportunities. We also have to weigh the benefits and the detriment, because any time a victim comes forward and recounts their story, be it in a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in a symbolic tribunal, or in a justice mechanism, they undergo re-traumatization. And we need to be able to limit that and control and weigh it against the benefit. Is it solely for the benefit of Westerners who come in and want to feel that they're doing something good? Is it actually reaching an audience that's broader than the initial audience that already knew about these things? And what is the secondary trauma that is provided? So I guess that would be a summary of what I would say, that civil society and justice both have something to give here.
Thanks very much, Roger. With that, we hit the end of the panel exactly. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everyone who contributed here and online. Thank you for your patience, because I got the order slightly wrong. I thought we had a terrific discussion, which will continue after the break and tomorrow. Do you have an announcement for us, Joe? We have 15 minutes now, right? Here she comes.
Is this on? Yeah. Okay, thank you very much indeed to our wonderful panel and our virtual speakers there. And yes, 15-minute coffee break, bang on time, for the first time, I think, during the whole conference. And please come back at 3:45 sharp. Thank you.